Not all American dreams are the same. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Licton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today I'm going to review Ocean Vuong's new book, The Emperor of Gladness. This just came out, and this is a phenomenal book. It's a quiet, contemplative book that I really highly encourage it. So let me explain a little bit what it's about. First off, Ocean Vuong is a poet, and this is his second novel. He's written one other novel, and he also has published two collections of poetry. So his other novel is On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous, and his two collections of poetry are Night Sky with Exit Wounds and Time is a Mother. Now, I first was introduced to him through his first novel, and then I read his poetry, and the novel hit me much more than the poetry did. Though the poetry, I have since read both collections numerous times since then, and there's something about it that is kind of ethereal and hard to pin down, but very evocative at the same time. And his prose writing is very similar. If you've read On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous, you'll know that his writing is incredibly poetic and lyrical and really, really beautiful. This book is the same, but also wildly different. So On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous has an uncommon narrative structure. It's written as a memoir that is a series of letters from the point of view of the narrator to his mother. Now, the overarching tragedy of that conceit in that novel is that his mother only speaks Vietnamese. She can't read English, but the only way he can share himself with her is through writing in English. And so there is a fundamental disconnect between the parts of himself that he needs to share with his mother and her ability to actually receive those parts of him. And so in that novel, it is written in a mixture of first and second person, him directly addressing his mother and then sharing about himself and his life story. This is a much more conventional novel, just in close third person, following the main character over the span of about a year of his life. Now, both of these have incidents that are based on Ocean Vuong's own life, but they're fictional stories. So for instance, in this, the main character, Howe, is in fact a refugee from Vietnam, and Ocean came here when he was 2. And his mother does in fact work as a nail salon and worked as a nail technician her whole life. And the main character here works at Home Market, which is Boston Market, which is a job that Ocean Vuong also had for a long time. And the main character in this, the conceit of it is that he ends up living with an old woman, taking care of her as she struggles with dementia, and he becomes a healthcare aide for her. And Ocean actually did that with his partner's grandmother, who is also from Lithuania. So there's a lot of similarities. And he grew up in a small town in Connecticut, of course, as this takes place. So there are a lot of similarities, which really create a liminal space for this novel and for his other novel. And if you read his poetry, some of the things that come up in his poetry, you see reflections of them in this story. And it just creates a really interesting space where truth and fiction are fuzzy. And that's okay. The idea that nothing is as clean cut as it seems, and that truth and memory are nebulous, I think is part of the appeal of this confessional style of storytelling. Now, I will say that On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous has this urgency and a desperation to it that makes it really hard to read at times. That isn't the case with this. This is much more subtle in the way it approaches. It has this underlining kind of loneliness, right? This haze of loneliness that you always feel kind of around you. This bitter aftertaste of despair that's almost always present, but it doesn't overwhelm the reader. It invites you in and lets you feel the emotions of these characters and of this storyline without really overwhelming in any way. In that way, it isn't quite as vivid as his previous novel. And that is in part due to the formatting, not having that second person narration as frequently, addressing the reader. And the tone itself is almost more laid back. I won't say more reflective, because that book is also incredibly reflective and emotional. And this one is as well. It isn't as urgent, as I mentioned. So what is the story? Now, there isn't a lot of plot in this story. It really is quote unquote literary fiction at its best. It is beautiful, beautiful writing, prose that is consistently gorgeous, that you want to just reread over and over again. And there are actually long sections that are incredibly descriptive. There are a few flashbacks, but for the most part, it takes place over the course of a year and it follows one character. It doesn't switch points of views. But sometimes, as you enter into a scene, there might be a page or even a few pages where there's just describing the scene, describing the atmosphere, making sure you know where you are, both in place and in time. And it's done subtly, right? The writing always feels light and buoyant, even though it is dense in imagery and it is dense in description. And it works really well because it is so lyrical. And the writing itself is so beautiful that you never feel overwhelmed by this. You feel like you are included in this small group of characters. Now, as I said, there isn't much plot. We meet our main character, Howe, as he is on a bridge about to jump. And he knows it's only a 100-foot drop down into the river below, but he also knows that the river is strong enough and cold enough that that will probably take him away. And as he's about to jump, he hears a voice calling him, and there is an old woman leaning out a window on the house near the river, and she calls him over. So instead of jumping, he goes to visit her, and she is an old woman. She's in her 80s, living by herself, living with dementia. Her live-in nurse left, never came back. She's on a waiting list. So she says, you know what? You will stay here. You'll take care of me. You'll make sure I take my pills and do all of that. And then everything will be fine. And that is the whole story. He ends up living with this old woman, and he takes care of her. He forms an incredibly intimate relationship with her. And then he also gets a job at Home Market, which is, like I said, Boston Market. So an upscale fast food restaurant, essentially. And then his life develops with all of his coworkers as well. One of whom is his cousin. That's how he got the job there, his cousin Sony. And that is the whole story. What happens in a life of this character as he's struggling with depression, with ideas of self-worth, with substance abuse, with poverty, of course, and all of these other issues all at once, and how he can find himself in the midst of this maelstrom, this mess that he in some ways has made for himself, or at least he thinks he's made for himself. So again, there isn't a lot of story, right? There isn't any action, so to speak. There's a few small little adventures that they go on, and they're all really exciting and interesting, and they add to the plot, but it isn't an action-packed book in any way. The plot is very simple. We're just following Howe over the course of a year. And yet there is always a perpetual sense of motion. You never feel stagnant. Now, part of that is because the story is structured by seasons, right? Spring, summer, fall, and winter, and so forth. So to some extent, you have this literary device that's pushing you forward. But even without that, the story always is moving forward. You always feel motion, yet there's this weird combination of stasis and motion, because Howe is trying to move on with his life, to figure out what he needs to do with his life. And you find out there's a reason. He's in the same town as his mother, but he can't talk to her. He refuses to. And you don't know why. You find out slowly what led him to that bridge, why he was about to jump, what's been going on in his life, why he's afraid of facing his mother and he won't face her face to face. All of that becomes revealed throughout the course of the story. And that is showing you where he's coming from. And yet he isn't able to move past that, even as the story moves forward, right? So there is this combination of stasis and movement that you always feel pulled along by, but you're never making leaps and bounds. So that's the narrative and the plot. Like I said, there isn't a lot of plot, but there is a narrative cohesion that always feels like it's moving. And in part, the writing is so gorgeous that it pulls you along with it, and it makes you invested in the world building, which is exquisite. I grew up in New England, not in a small town New England, but I grew up in New England, and it feels like you're there. The writing is so gorgeous. You know, before I get to the heart of the story, which is the characters, let me just read you the opening paragraph, which is describing East Gladness, which is where he lives. That's the name of the small town. And it'll give you a taste of how he creates world building and how he invites the reader in. The hardest thing in the world is to live only once. But it's beautiful here. Even the ghosts agree. Morning, when light rinses this place the shade of oatmeal, they rise as mist over the rye across the tracks and stumble toward the black-spired pines, searching for their names, names that no longer live in any living thing's mouth. Our town is raised up from a scab of land along a river in New England. When the prehistoric glaciers melted, the valley became a world-sized lake, and when that dried up, it left a silvery trickle along the basin called the Connecticut, Algonquin for Long Tidal River. The sediment here is rich with every particle welcoming to life. As you approach, you'll be flanked by wide stretches of thumb-sized buds shooting lucent through April mud. Within months, these saplings will stand as packed rows of broadleaf tobacco and silver queen corn. Beyond the graveyard, whose stones have lost their names to years, there's a covered bridge laid up over a dried-up brook whose memory of water never reached this century. Cross that, and you'll find us. That is the kind of writing that imbues this whole story with an emotional gravitas, right? It is descriptive, and it is propelling, and it is inviting all at the same time. And the story is an incredibly emotional story, even without the kind of sense of desperation and urgency as I found in Unearthed Briefly Gorgeous. There is a tragedy at the heart of the story, because the story is really the quintessential great American novel, I think. It is telling a story of the American dream, or the absence of the American dream. You know, what is more American than minimum wage service work? What is more nationalistic than substance abuse as a means of coping with the ways that the world has left you down and left you behind, and those ways that you feel like you are letting others down? What is more patriotic than having foolish hopes and dreams and living sometimes, not always by your own choice, in more than one reality at the same time? This story is telling what it means to be an American, to be a working class American, what it means to be running from your past, but also afraid of running from your past and wanting to be coddled and held by those who you care about. What does it mean to create family for yourself where there was only strangers because you need someone to lift you up because society isn't doing it? Right? That is the quintessence of the story. Now, the characters, all of the characters you meet, they're so real. They're so genuine. They are multidimensional. Kai obviously is the main character, this troubled young man, this young boy of a man. He's 1920 when we meet him. And through him, you meet Grazina, this elderly Lithuanian woman who survived Stalin and Hitler to now be living alone and neglected by her children, living with dementia and just reaching out for someone to help her. And then when he gets a job at Home Market, you meet all of his other coworkers who all have their own quirks. Another young boy of a man who is working so he can pay for his sister's rehab, and a divorced mom whose child died of cancer, and so forth. Every one of the characters has their own story, which feels genuine, it feels real, it feels like a slice of life in the most intimate of ways. And none of this is kind of poverty porn or trauma porn, right? It's not exploiting these characters, but it is lifting them up and saying this is America, and this is us living the American dream as best we're able, using the resources we have, which often are substances and alcohol, and are doing other things to numb the incessant feeling of not enough that is bred into us. So as I said, the writing and the world building are really beautiful. They have this incredible splendor to the novel, but their splendor pales to that of the characters, because the characters are the heart of the story. And through the characters and the relationships that those characters form, especially this really beautiful, simple relationship between Howe and Grazina, the old woman that he begins living with, the story reflects on and examines ideas of family, but also ideas of identity, trauma, race, class, self-perception, self-worth, and maybe most importantly, purpose. What are we doing with our lives in this world? How are we serving ourselves and serving others? And how are we constantly fighting the entropy of the American dream, which doesn't really help us? It only holds us back. It uses us as stepping stones so it can find its own profit somewhere else. Like I said, this is a very American story. It is a story about immigrants and a story about class and a story about working hard and yet never being able to work enough to get outside of the box that has been prescribed for you by society, and yet holding on to a sense of hope, holding on to dreams even when it seems like all they're doing is harming you. This story isn't necessarily as intense or desperate as On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, the author's previous novel, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't insist upon itself in any less capacity. Because what it is ultimately doing is exploring humanity, and it is embracing that idea of humanity for dear life and not letting go. And it brings the reader along this journey to show you that humanity has a lot of different faces. It doesn't always look the same way. And in order to really be living a full life, you have to understand the breadth and scope of the quiet moments, of what it means to live on the margins, and what it means to search for genuine happiness, especially a happiness that is measured not by what you own or what you possess or how you are looked upon within society, but by the relationships you've been able to create as you move along during your journey. So that's it. That is The Emperor of Gladness. I won't say too much else about it, except that it is a gorgeous book. The writing itself is really spellbinding. It pulls you in. It's beautiful. It's lush. It's delicious just to read out loud as you go along. The story itself is tender yet genuine. You feel for all the characters and you feel like you are one of the characters. It really invites you in. And again, it is in that liminal space between truth and fiction that says these specifics aren't real, but just because these specific details aren't real doesn't mean this story isn't real, right? And that is what makes it so enticing, I think. So I really enjoyed it, if you can't tell. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Have any of you had a chance to read this? Or have you read his other novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, or either of his poetry collections? I'd love to hear any of your thoughts or ideas down below in the comment section. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.